How high-value men talk to women. There is a particular kind of man who walks into a room and, without raising his voice, without performing, without trying to impress anyone, changes the temperature of the space. Women notice him first, not because he is louder, not because he is the most attractive man present, but because the way he speaks carries a certain gravity. His words are few, but they land. His questions are simple, but they feel like they matter. He does not chase attention, and because he does not chase it, attention comes to him. This video is about that man, not a fictional archetype, not a fantasy, but a set of communication habits that any man can build, layer by layer, until they become second nature. High value is not about money, height, or charisma you were born with. It is a way of relating to yourself first, and to others second. And nowhere is this more visible than in the way a man talks to a woman he is interested in, or simply a woman he is speaking to in any context. A colleague, a stranger, a friend. Before we go further, if you want more content like this, real, grounded lessons on masculine self-mastery, communication, and inner strength, subscribe to this channel. Every subscription helps this message reach more men who need to hear it. Now let's get into it. We will walk through several principles, each one a piece of the larger picture. Along the way, I will tell you a short story about a man named Daniel, who learned most of this the hard way, and who eventually became the kind of man women wanted to be around. Stay until the end, because his story ties everything together. Principle 1. He speaks slowly because he is not afraid of silence. Most men rush their words. They fill every pause with noise because silence feels like exposure. It feels like a gap where judgment might creep in, where the other person might notice something is wrong. So they talk fast, laugh nervously, over-explain, and fill space that did not need filling. A high-value man does the opposite. He lets silence sit. When a woman asks him a question, he does not blurt the first thing that comes to mind. He takes a breath. He considers. Then he answers, and because he took his time, his answer carries weight. This is not a trick. It is simply the natural behavior of a man who is not afraid of what happens in the quiet. Silence is uncomfortable for people who have not made peace with themselves. If you are constantly seeking approval, silence feels like danger. Because in the absence of your own noise, you might have to sit with your own thoughts, your own doubts, your own insecurities. But once a man has done that work, once he has sat with his own mind and made peace with it, silence becomes a tool rather than a threat. Practice this the next time you are in conversation with someone you find attractive. Resist the urge to fill every gap. Let a question hang in the air for a second before you answer. Let a joke land without immediately following it up with another one. You will notice something remarkable. People lean in during silence. They pay closer attention. The pressure to entertain constantly is the pressure of a boy trying to be liked. The comfort in stillness is the mark of a man who already likes himself. Principle 2. He asks questions he actually wants answered. There is a difference between asking a question to keep a conversation moving and asking a question because you are genuinely curious about the answer. Women can tell the difference almost instantly, even if they cannot always articulate why. A high-value man is curious about people, not in a performative way, not as a strategy borrowed from a book, but as a genuine extension of his character. When he asks a woman what she does for work, he is not waiting for his turn to talk about himself. He is actually listening, and his follow-up question comes from something she said 30 seconds earlier, not from a mental script he memorized. This kind of listening is rare, and rarity is what creates value. Most conversations today are two people waiting for their turn to speak, each one rehearsing their next line while the other person is still talking. A man who breaks that pattern, who listens like the answer actually matters to him, becomes memorable simply by being different. There is a deeper principle here too. Curiosity about others requires a stable sense of self. Insecure men often struggle to ask real questions because every question risks revealing that they do not have an equally impressive answer to bring to the table. A grounded man does not have that fear. He can be endlessly curious about someone else's life because his own worth is not contingent on matching or outshining what he learns. Principle 3. He does not compliment excessively. Compliments, used sparingly and honestly, carry weight. Compliments, used constantly and indiscriminately, become noise. A man who tells a woman she is beautiful within the first 2 minutes of meeting her has already spent his currency. Worse, he has revealed his hand, that he is trying to win her approval rather than simply being present. A high-value man compliments rarely, and when he does, it is specific. Not, "You're beautiful, but the way you talked about your work just now," that kind of clarity is rare. Specificity signals that he was actually paying attention, that the compliment is earned rather than automatic. It also signals confidence, because a specific compliment requires a man to reveal what he genuinely noticed, rather than hiding behind a generic phrase that could apply to anyone. There is also restraint involved. A man secure in himself does not need to constantly affirm the woman in front of him in order to keep her engaged. He trusts that his presence, his conversation, and his character are enough. Over-complimenting often comes from a fear that if he stops, she will lose interest. But that fear itself is what makes a man less attractive, because it reveals dependency rather than confidence. If you find yourself reaching for a compliment out of nervousness, pause. Ask a question instead. Save the compliment for a moment when it will actually mean something. If this is resonating with you, take a second right now and subscribe to the channel. This series exists to help men build exactly this kind of grounded, magnetic communication, and there is a lot more coming. Principle 4. He holds his frame under pressure. Frame is a concept that gets thrown around a lot, but at its core, it simply means this: whose reality is the conversation operating inside of? A man with a strong frame does not bend his opinions, his plans, or his sense of humor just because someone pushes back or teases him. He can be disagreed with, even challenged, without losing his footing. Imagine a woman teases a man playfully, testing to see how he reacts. A man with a weak frame gets defensive, or worse, tries too hard to prove himself. A man with a strong frame laughs, plays along, or simply holds steady, unbothered. This is not about winning an argument. It is about not needing to win, because his sense of self was never on the table to begin with. This shows up in small moments constantly. If a woman cancels plans last minute, a man with weak frame either explodes with frustration or collapses into over-apologetic reassurance, desperate to keep her interest. A man with strong frame responds calmly, reschedules if it makes sense, and moves on with his day, unshaken. His mood was never dependent on her decision in the first place. Frame is built the same way muscle is built, through repetition and resistance. Every time you hold steady under a small social pressure instead of caving, you strengthen it. Every time you cave, you weaken it over months and years. This compounds into a man who simply cannot be rattled by the ordinary frictions of dating and relation. Principle 5. He speaks in statements, not constant questions. There is a subtle but important difference between a man who asks, "Is that okay?" after every sentence and a man who simply states his intentions clearly. The first pattern, repeated enough, signals a need for constant validation. The second signals a man who trusts his own judgment. Compare: "Maybe we could get coffee sometime, if that's okay with you." 2. "Let's get coffee Thursday." The second version is not aggressive or presumptuous, it is simply clear. It gives the woman something concrete to respond to, rather than asking her to do the emotional labor of deciding for him. High-value men make plans. They do not outsource every decision to the other person out of fear of being too forward. This does not mean being rigid or ignoring her preferences. A grounded man adjusts easily if she suggests something else. But he leads with a clear proposal rather than an open-ended question that puts all the weight of decision-making onto her shoulder. Women, generally, find this refreshing, because so much of modern dating has become an exhausting back and forth of nobody wanting to commit to a plan first. The deeper lesson here applies beyond dating. A man who speaks in statements rather than endless hedged questions is a man who has practiced making decisions and living with the outcome. That is a skill, and like any skill, it is built through use. Principle 6. He does not need to fill every silence with validation-seeking jokes. There is a particular habit many men fall into: cracking jokes purely to gauge whether the woman still likes them. Every few sentences, a joke, a self-deprecating comment, a check for laughter, an anxious scan of her face for approval. This habit, while often unconscious, communicates something the man does not intend: that his emotional state is riding on her reaction. A high-value man can be funny, genuinely funny, without needing constant confirmation that his humor landed. He tells a story because it is a good story, not because he needs her laughter to feel okay about himself. If a joke does not land, he does not scramble to save it, he simply continues, unbothered, because his sense of humor was never up for a vote in the first place. This distinction matters more than people realize. Humor used from a place of security is magnetic. Humor used from a place of anxiety, even when technically funny, creates a subtle discomfort, because the other person can sense the neediness underneath. Women often describe this feeling as a man trying too hard, even when they cannot pinpoint exactly why the interaction felt slightly off. The fix is not to suppress your humor. It is to decouple it from your need for approval. Say the funny thing because it is true to who you are. Let it land or not land. Either way, keep going. Principle 7. He talks about what he is building, not what he has. There is a meaningful difference between a man who talks about his possessions, his past achievements, or his status, and a man who talks about what he is currently building, learning, or working toward. The first kind of conversation, however impressive on paper, often lands as flat or even slightly desperate. The second kind of conversation is magnetic, because it reveals direction, and direction is one of the most attractive qualities a man can carry. A man who says, "I run a small business," and stops there gives less than a man who says, "I'm building something right now that terrifies me a little, but I think it's going to work." The second version invites curiosity. It shows vulnerability without weakness, ambition without arrogance, and most importantly, it shows a man who is in motion rather than a man who is resting on past accomplishments. Women are drawn to momentum, not because they are shallow, but because momentum signals a future, a life that is going somewhere, a partner who will keep growing rather than stagnate. A man who only talks about the past, about what he used to do or what he already achieved, can unintentionally signal that his best years are behind him, even if that is far from the truth. So when you talk about yourself, talk about the edge of your life, the project you are still shaping, the skill you are still sharpening, the goal you have not yet reached. That edge is where energy lies, and energy is what people remember long after the conversation ends. Quick reminder before we continue. If you want a steady stream of this kind of grounded, practical wisdom, subscribe to the channel now. It costs nothing, and it helps this content reach more men. Principle 8. He respects her intelligence enough to disagree with her. One of the fastest ways a man signals low value, often without realizing it, is by agreeing with everything a woman says. It seems polite on the surface. It feels safe. But constant agreement communicates something uncomfortable underneath, that this man does not trust his own opinions enough to risk friction. A high-value man listens carefully, and when he genuinely disagrees, he says so, respectfully but honestly. If she makes an argument he finds flawed, he pushes back, not to dominate the conversation, but because he respects her enough to engage with her as an equal rather than as someone who needs to be managed and appeased. This kind of honest friction, handled with warmth rather than hostility, often deepens attraction rather than damaging it. Women frequently report finding constant agreement suspicious or even a little insulting, as though the man does not believe she can handle a real conversation. Respectful disagreement, on the other hand, signals that he sees her as capable of intellectual sparring, capable of hearing another viewpoint without falling apart. The key word here is respectful. This is not about being contrarian for its own sake, or turning every conversation into a debate. It is about being honest rather than performing agreement out of fear. A man who only ever says what he thinks the woman wants to hear eventually becomes forgettable, because there is no real person underneath the agreeable mask. Say what you actually think. Let the conversation breathe. Principle 9. He ends conversations before they get boring. Most men, out of a scarcity mindset, drag conversations on far longer than they should, terrified that ending the interaction means losing the connection forever. This usually backfires. A conversation that goes on too long, past its natural energy, starts to feel effortful, and effort is the enemy of attraction. A high-value man reads energy. When a conversation is at its peak, a shared laugh, an interesting exchange, a moment of real connection, he is willing to end it there, rather than milking it until it goes flat. This might mean excusing himself from a party conversation while it is still fun, or ending a phone call while there is still something to look forward to next time. This takes discipline, because the instinct is to hold on, but ending on a high note leaves the other person wanting more, which is a far stronger position than exhausting the interaction until both people are relieved it is over. It also communicates something important, that this man has other places to be, other things to do, a life that does not revolve entirely around this one conversation. Practice this deliberately. The next time a conversation with someone you are interested in is going well, resist the urge to stretch it out. Say something like, "I've got to run, but I'd like to continue this," and mean it. You will find that this creates more anticipation than any amount of extended conversation ever could. Principle 10. He is kind without being a pushover. There is a common misunderstanding that being high value means being cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. This is a mistake. The men who mistake coldness for strength usually end up alone, because coldness is not attractive, it is simply a defense mechanism dressed up as confidence. A genuinely high-value man is warm. He is kind. He remembers small details about the people he cares about. He shows up for his friends. But his kindness has boundaries. He does not let people take advantage of his good nature, and he does not sacrifice his own needs simply to avoid conflict. This balance, warmth with boundaries, is far rarer, and far more attractive, than either pure kindness or pure coldness on their own. When a woman crosses a line, whether through disrespect, dishonesty, or simply asking for something unreasonable, a high-value man addresses it directly and calmly, without cruelty but also without collapsing into people-pleasing silence. He can say, "That doesn't work for me," without raising his voice, without apologizing excessively, and without needing to punish her for it afterward. This balance is difficult to strike because most men lean too far in one direction or the other. Either they are doormats who never assert a boundary, or they overcorrect into performative toughness that reads as insecurity. The real work is finding the steady middle, a man who is generous with his warmth and equally clear about his limits. A short story, Daniel. Let me tell you about a man named Daniel. A few years ago, Daniel was the kind of man who talked too much on dates. He filled every silence, laughed nervously after every sentence, and constantly checked the woman's face for signs of approval. He complimented too early, agreed with everything, and stretched every conversation far past its natural ending, terrified that if he stopped talking, the connection would disappear. Daniel had good intentions. He genuinely cared about the women he dated. But his anxiety leaked into every interaction, and women could feel it, even when they could not name exactly what felt off. He got fewer second dates than he expected, and each rejection made him try even harder the next time, which only made the pattern worse. One winter, Daniel met a woman named Amara at a mutual friend's dinner. He liked her instantly, and true to habit, he started talking quickly, filling silence, complimenting her within minutes. But that night, something interrupted his pattern. Amara asked him a question, and instead of rushing to answer, Daniel paused, genuinely thinking it through before responding. It was an accident, not a strategy. He was simply tired that night, less anxious than usual. He noticed something in that pause. Amara leaned in slightly. She waited for his answer instead of filling the gap herself. The silence had not scared her away, it had drawn her closer. That small moment changed something in Daniel. He began practicing that pause deliberately, in every conversation, not just with women he was attracted to, but with colleagues, friends, and strangers. He noticed that when he stopped rushing to fill every gap, people listened more closely to what he actually said. He began asking questions because he was curious, not because he needed to keep the conversation moving. He stopped complimenting immediately and instead waited until something genuinely struck him. Over the following year, Daniel changed slowly, the way most real change happens, not through a single transformation, but through hundreds of small repetitions. He held his frame when a date canceled last minute. He disagreed, respectfully, when he actually disagreed. He ended conversations on high notes instead of dragging them out. He talked about the business he was building rather than the job he already had. None of it happened overnight, and there were plenty of nights where old habits crept back in. A year and a half after that dinner, Daniel and Amara started dating seriously. Years later, they got married. Amara later told him that what drew her in that first night was not anything he said, but the moment he stopped performing and simply let a silence exist between them. She said it felt like the first time she was talking to a real person instead of a man auditioning for her approval. Daniel's story is not unique. It is the story of nearly every man who has learned to communicate from a place of security rather than anxiety. The habits are learnable, the pause is learnable, the frame is learnable. None of it requires a personality transplant. Only consistent practice and a willingness to sit with discomfort long enough for new patterns to take root. Principle 11. He does not chase, he invites. There is an important distinction between chasing someone and inviting them into your life. Chasing is anxious, one-sided, and communicates scarcity, as though this one woman is the only chance he will ever have. Inviting is calm, open-handed, and communicates abundance, an offer extended without desperation attached to the outcome. A high-value man extends invitations clearly. He asks a woman out directly, makes plans without excessive hedging, and follows through on what he says he will do. But once the invitation is extended, he does not chase if she is unresponsive or uninterested. He does not send 5 follow-up messages when one goes unanswered. He does not spiral into anxious analysis of what he did wrong. He simply lets the invitation stand, and moves forward with his life either way. This is not about playing games or pretending not to care. It is a genuine internal state. A man who has enough going on in his own life that any single interaction, however exciting, does not become the center of his emotional world. Paradoxically, this is often what makes women more interested, not less, because it signals a man whose life is full regardless of the outcome of this one interaction. If you find yourself checking your phone repeatedly, rereading messages, or feeling anxious about a lack of response, take that as useful information about where your attention currently lives. The work is not to fake indifference. The work is to build a life full enough that indifference becomes real. Principle 12. He owns his mistakes without groveling. No man communicates perfectly all the time. High value is not about flawlessness. It is about how a man handles the moments when he gets it wrong. A man who forgets an important date, says something insensitive, or shows up late has a choice in how he responds, and that response reveals more about his character than the mistake itself. A high-value man owns the mistake directly. He does not deflect, make excuses, or minimize what happened. But he also does not collapse into excessive groveling, repeated apologies, or self-flagellation that makes the other person responsible for comforting him about his own mistake. He says, "That was on me, I'm sorry, I'll do better," and then he actually does better. Simple, direct, and followed by action rather than words alone. This balance matters because excessive apologizing, paradoxically, can feel worse to the other person than a clean, brief acknowledgement. It shifts the emotional burden onto them, forcing them to reassure the man that it is okay, when really they just wanted the mistake acknowledged and corrected. A high-value man understands that accountability is a gift he gives the relationship, not a performance he puts on for approval. This principle extends far beyond dating. Men who can own mistakes cleanly, in their careers, their friendships, and their families, build a reputation for integrity that outlasts any single error. People trust a man who can say, "I was wrong," without drama, because it signals that his sense of self does not depend on always being right. Principle 13. His tone rarely rises. Watch how a high-value man speaks when things go wrong. A plan falls apart, a disagreement heats up, someone is rude to him in public. His volume rarely changes. His pace rarely quickens. He does not need to raise his voice to be taken seriously, because his words already carry enough weight on their own. This is not suppression. Suppressing anger and not feeling it at all are different things. A grounded man feels frustration like anyone else, but he has trained himself to express it through clear, calm words rather than volume or aggression. This calm is not weakness. It is often far more intimidating and commanding than shouting could ever be, because it signals total control. Women, in particular, often describe feeling unsafe or on edge around men whose emotional temperature rises quickly and unpredictably. A man who stays level, even during real conflict, creates a sense of safety that allows genuine intimacy to develop. People open up to those who feel stable, not to those who feel like a storm that might turn at any moment. This is a trainable skill. The next time you feel frustration building in a conversation, notice the urge to raise your voice or speed up your speech, and consciously slow down instead. Lower your volume rather than raising it. You will find, over time, that this single habit changes how people respond to you across every area of your life, not only in romantic conversations. If this message is landing for you, hit subscribe now. This channel exists to give men practical, grounded tools for exactly this kind of transformation, and there is much more ahead. Principle 14. He talks less about himself, and more through his actions. There is an old idea, often traced back to Stoic philosophy, that a man's character should be visible in what he does, not in what he claims about himself. A man who constantly tells people how loyal, ambitious, or disciplined he is often reveals the opposite, an insecurity that requires constant verbal reinforcement because his actions have not yet earned that reputation on their own. A high-value man rarely narrates his own virtues. He does not announce that he is a hard worker. He simply works hard, and people notice over time. He does not claim to be trustworthy. He simply keeps his word, consistently, until trust becomes the natural conclusion others draw about him. His communication with women follows this same principle. He does not need to convince her of his character through clever words. He lets his consistency speak, across weeks and months, far louder than any single conversation could. This does not mean a man should be silent about his life or his goals. It simply means the emphasis shifts from persuasion to demonstration. Instead of telling a woman he is dependable, he shows up when he says he will. Instead of telling her he listens, he remembers what she told him weeks earlier and brings it up naturally. The words become confirmation of a pattern she has already observed, rather than a substitute for that pattern. This is, in many ways, the foundation beneath every other principle in this video. Communication is not only about what leaves your mouth. It is about whether your words and your actions tell the same story. When they do, a man's presence becomes remarkably steady, and steadiness, more than charm, more than wit, more than good looks, is what women consistently describe as magnetic in the men who hold their attention long after the first conversation ends. Principle 15. He protects his energy before he enters a room. Most men walk into social situations reactive, absorbing whatever mood is already present and letting it dictate how they show up. A high-value man does the opposite. He takes a few minutes before he enters a room, a party, a date, a work event, to settle his own state first, so he arrives grounded rather than scrambling to catch up emotionally with everyone else. This might look like a short walk before a date, a few slow breaths in the car, or simply a moment of quiet before stepping through the door. It sounds small, almost trivial, but the effect is significant. A man who arrives already centered brings that steadiness into the room with him, rather than absorbing anxiety from the environment and projecting it outward in his conversation. Contrast this with the common pattern of rushing straight from a stressful commute into a date, still mentally scattered, still carrying the tension of the day. That scattered energy shows up in rushed speech, distracted eye contact, and the nervous over-talking we discussed earlier. Women pick up on this immediately, even without being able to name it directly. Building this habit does not require an elaborate ritual. It requires only the discipline to protect a few minutes of transition time before important interactions, treating your own internal state as something worth managing deliberately, rather than something that simply happens to you based on the chaos of the day. Principle 16. He lets attraction build instead of forcing it. There is a temptation, especially early in dating, to try to manufacture attraction through effort, trying harder to be charming, funny, or impressive in a single conversation. A high-value man understands that real attraction is rarely built in a single burst of effort. It accumulates slowly, through consistency, presence, and the small moments that reveal character over time. This means he does not panic if a first conversation feels merely pleasant rather than electric. He does not conclude that the connection has failed simply because there was no immediate spark. He trusts the process, showing up as himself consistently across several interactions, and lets attraction develop at its own pace rather than forcing an artificial intensity that cannot be sustained. This patience separates him from men who burn brightly for one date and then fade, because the intensity they generated was manufactured rather than authentic, and manufactured energy is exhausting to maintain. A grounded man plays a longer game, understanding that the steadiest attractions are usually the ones that build gradually, brick by brick, rather than the ones that flared up instantly and burned out just as fast. This principle requires a kind of faith that being consistently, calmly yourself, across time, is more compelling than any single dazzling performance could ever be. It is, in many ways, the hardest principle on this list, because it asks a man to resist the urge to control the outcome and instead trust the slow, steady accumulation of genuine connection. Principle 17. He treats every woman with the same baseline respect. One of the clearest signals of a man's underlying character is how he treats a waitress, a stranger, or someone who has nothing to offer him, compared to how he treats a woman he is trying to impress. A high-value man does not switch personas depending on who is watching or what he stands to gain. His baseline respect for people is consistent, whether he is speaking to the woman across the table on a first date or the person clearing plates in the background. Women notice this far more than men often assume. A date can go beautifully right up until a man is dismissive or rude to a server, and that single moment can undo everything that came before it, because it reveals something the polished conversation had been hiding. Consistency of character across contexts is one of the strongest indicators of long-term trustworthiness, and people are wired to look for it, often without consciously realizing they are doing so. This consistency also removes a tremendous amount of pressure from any single interaction. A man who treats everyone with the same grounded respect does not need to perform differently around someone he finds attractive, because his behavior was never a performance to begin with. It is simply who he is, in every room, with every person, regardless of what he might gain or lose from the interaction. Building this habit starts small. A genuine thank you to someone providing a service, patience with someone having a difficult day, courtesy extended without expectation of anything in return. Over time, this consistency becomes so natural that it stops requiring conscious effort at all, and it becomes simply an accurate reflection of the man underneath. Bringing it together. None of these principles work in isolation, and none of them are tricks to be deployed strategically on a first date and then abandoned. They are habits of a man who has done the deeper work of building a stable relationship with himself first. The pause before speaking, the genuine curiosity, the sparing compliment, the steady frame under pressure, the willingness to disagree respectfully, the clean acknowledgement of mistakes, the calm tone even under frustration, all of it flows from the same root, which is a man who no longer needs external validation to know his own worth. This is why chasing techniques alone rarely works. A man can memorize every line in this video, every principle, every example, and still come across as anxious and needy if the internal work has not been done. The words are downstream of the character. Build the character, and the words follow naturally, because you are no longer performing a script. You are simply speaking as yourself, fully present, unafraid of silence, unafraid of disagreement, unafraid of the outcome. Daniel's story is proof that this transformation is available to any man willing to practice it consistently, even imperfectly, even with setbacks along the way. He did not become a different person. He became more fully himself, stripped of the anxious performance that had been getting in his own way for years. If you are a man working on this in your own life, know that the process is slow, and that is fine. Every pause you hold instead of rushing to fill it, every honest disagreement you voice instead of collapsing into agreement, every boundary you set with warmth instead of cruelty, is a small deposit into the kind of man you are building yourself into. Women notice this man, not because he is chasing their attention, but because he has stopped chasing altogether, and built something worth being noticed for instead. Before you go, if this video gave you something useful, subscribe to this channel. This is exactly the kind of content we build here, practical, grounded lessons for men who want to grow into their fullest, steadiest selves. There is more coming, and I would love to have you along for it. Keep becoming.